I think we have an update regarding Brendan, isn't it? Yeah, we have a Brendan Schaub update and the whole Bryan Callen affair at T-Fat-K. Now, personally, I think this might be, in my opinion, after watching this video, this might be the last time I mention anything concerning those kind of guys. I think it's a little bit, it's getting a little bit boring. Essentially, if you don't know the story, Bryan got himself in a bit of an issue. He was accused of a very serious sexual assault, which essentially led to his career being put on complete standstill. This is off the back of course, the allegations against Chris D'Elia, which has kind of negatively impacted, I guess, the comedy scene in LA and wider places. People have kind of had a bit more of an extra eye on that scene in general, and fairly so, I think, in my opinion. I think every industry has its bad actors, and again, unfortunately, in this cancel culture world that we live in, an accusation is as bad as an actual charge. And Bryan Callen's career has essentially been put on complete ice. Now, of course, Bryan Callen hasn't necessarily helped himself in this situation by deleting images of himself and Chris D'Elia, denouncing their friendship, crying on camera, essentially trying to rewrite his wrongs in public, but doing it in a really, heavy-handed and clumsy way, as per some of his other actions in the past, and just necessarily dealt with it in the right possible way possible. And of course, people have been looking at Brendan Schaub in the wrong way too. There may be their agreement to sign on with Cast Media has essentially negatively impacted the both of them, because they haven't had the opportunity to speak about what's essentially happened to them in their careers in a very honest way. And now they're in a position where Brendan Schaub is having to rebrand The Fire and the Kid into some other show in order for that thing to continue, because at the moment the sponsors that they have on board with Cast Media are refusing to allow Bryan Callen to get back on the T-Fat-K podcast to say his piece, or to just be on camera with Brendan at this moment in time, because of the allegations against him are so serious. So Brendan Schaub got on to Steve-O's podcast. I think he was a recent guest on The Fire and the Kid, and I guess they kind of exchanged favors in that regard. And he spoke honestly about the situation. And I, in my opinion, think what Brendan Schaub is saying is probably true. I know a lot of people are probably still on the kind of side of like he's a complete asshole and they don't believe anything he says. But I generally do think the guy's a doof in some ways, right? Obviously, his COVID rhetoric has been, laughable to say the least. His disinterest over the years with MMA has been really interesting. That's another one too. Someone needs to make a video on the fact that Brendan has been able to finesse Showtime for I don't know how many seasons it's been now of his show, but he clearly has which is maybe a warranted thing, right? He clearly has a disdain for what the UFC has become, or what it basically represents. There's a lot of PTSD there from his bad experience dealing with Dana White, dealing with the UFC hierarchy, that he essentially comes off very disinterested when he's talking about MMA. I've never seen somebody so disinterested talking about something that they're getting paid handsomely for, especially something that he was a professional at himself, right? You'd assume he'd have a bit more passion towards it, but he doesn't necessarily have it. And the frustrating thing about it with Brendan is that when he actually does get interested in actual, doing some research into the fighters and actually analyzing some of their previous fights and going into some sort of detail and keeping himself up to date with actually the goings on in that industry, he actually does provide some fairly nuanced and interesting point of views. But when he's just flying off the cuff and just presenting and talking as it goes and just reacting to whatever chin reads him, it comes off really, really uninformed and really dull. And again, it really surprised me that he still has people following him on that show. It's like, it's probably the worst thing that he does out of all the shows that he presents on there. But again, credit to him for finessing Showtime out of that money. That's his prerogative. But I do think there is a side of him where he is definitely kind of respectful and he's definitely respectful and understanding of the role Bryan Callen played in his career, especially when you look at, if you kind of listen to his come up story, the fact that he was essentially almost been at every other stage of his career, in every other thing that he pursued, it never quite worked out. And in the moment he was able to kind of pop and have any kind of solid, any kind of sort of base, any kind of success in podcasting, he just ran with it, right? He didn't let it go. And of course, a huge part of that journey was Bryan Callen, right? His decision, or his kind of advice for Brendan to get on stage and start doing stand-up, has essentially led him to having this stand-up career that he has at the moment. Whether or not he's funny or not is, subjective. Most people would say it isn't subjective because he generally isn't funny, but I think his understanding of the role Bryan has played in his life, and regardless of what happens with Bryan in this accusation, he understands that he can't kind of abandon him at this point in time. He can probably abandon Chris D'Elia because he can just say, hey, I didn't know this guy was a monster behind the scenes, blah, 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 blah. But he can't abandon Bryan, regardless of if it's true or not, because without Bryan, where would Brendan actually be? And he kind of speaks about it pretty well on this podcast here with Steve-O. So let's hear a little bit what Brendan Schaub has to say. And then, of course, I will give you my comments as we proceed. Let's let the video load up on here on YouTube. I should have probably got it loaded up previously, so please excuse the time and the waiting.
And at the time, he is Bruce, but he had like this long ponytail and like these real nice nails. I'm like, man, maybe Brian's fucking
with me. Hit this pause. Okay, let's bring it back. I think it's nearly on like the 30-minute mark. So let's bring it back a little bit. 1 second.
Now you just said that you're doing material about your buddies getting canceled. We were honestly, like Paul brought, he says probably shouldn't ask him about that.
I was like, I don't want to ask it, but maybe you can ask it.
No, I'm open. You can fire away, man. I'm gonna open.
I mean, I'm just curious, like your perception of how that went down. I mean, it's.
I don't think anyone's ever like equipped to deal with that, you know, because Brian's been so influential on me, and he's been such a positive person in my life, and he's just, from what I know, Bryan Callen, he's a great dude.
He's been so supportive of me.
Yeah, he's always thought very highly of you, and so for me, it's just such a weird world because where I come from, when I was having my issues with Dana White or I was having my issues with Fox or anything, I get on. This is my weapon. I get on the mic and I go, man. I don't pull any punches, and I even if I'm in the wrong, I say it on the mic. So my initial reaction was
that's kind of gay, isn't it, to say it? It's my weapon, but I guess what he means. I get what he means. And to be fair, if you remember, if you're a long time T5K listener, you would have known that whole debacle they went through at Fox was a pretty intense, isn't it, right? Some of the stuff that was going on behind the scenes, and it did feel like he got a lot from just being able to get on the mic and just say his piece. He was able to kind of air out a lot of the grievances, and essentially that's what allowed him to kind of step away from their contract and retain the IP of the Fire and the Kid and continue doing it on other platforms. And obviously they didn't learn from that experience because they just went and signed up with Cast Media again, which essentially put them in another position where they can't say this piece again. But they definitely learned a lot from that experience, and Brendan having the ability to speak about it openly on the Fire and the Kid in the early days, especially issues with Dana White, because I think that was also the time Brendan might have been the first person that called out Dana White for being a complete cunt, right? Which he is. And people, for some reason, some part of the MMA fan base loves to call him the adorable goof, and they kind of love to laugh about the stuff that he does. But when you actually analyze some of the more backhanded and undermining stuff that he's done to fighters, the fact that they don't get paid adequately still at this moment in time, it just, it goes beyond, it's just beyond even worth even talking about as a debate. But Brendan was definitely one of the first, in my experience, professional fighters that were actually out there in the forefront, speaking about it openly and giving his piece about it. So I definitely understand his kind of, the conflict he kind of felt, like, I can't necessarily defend my friend, but it definitely was probably the best decision that they definitely took collectively for Brendan Schaub not to get on the mic and speak about it, because especially nowadays, the Brendan of old isn't the Brendan of now, which is why a lot of people have turned off from Fighting Kid and they've stopped following him, and they've always leaving negative comments on his posts, and he gets he's always having to delete comments and block people all over the place, and he has a very negative opinion of social media. He says he's not on it, then he's on it. He's always talking about haters and all that sort of malarkey, mostly because he's kind of he's transformed into he's some other person now. The way he kind of reacts would have been very detrimental to Bryan's overall career. If Bryan already is doing a lot of bad things that are necessarily not painting him in the best of light, imagine how worse it would have been if Brendan was allowed to go on the Firing Kid and air out, he says what he feels, and say his piece regarding this issue, and kind of really put his foot in the mud concerning some of the allegations that he has against him. Regardless of what he actually thinks personally about the issue, it definitely wouldn't have helped Bryan Callen's case.
Get on there and fucking go. And Brian's like, you can't do that, buddy. I'm like, what do you mean I can't do it? He's like, you can't do that. It's going to hurt me more. It's going to help me. I want you to do nothing. I'm like, all right, well, I'll let you do it. He goes, I can't be there. And I'm like,
now, I don't know how true this story is, because it feels like to me, especially when the allegations come out, Bryan was the first person to get on social and say, hey, I'm going to be on the T5K podcast on Saturday talking about this. Tune in, right? I'm not gonna take this line down, which is understandable, right? Because if you listen to the Fire and the Kid a few months ago, you would have known Bryan was getting a little bit tetchy when anything concerning counterculture come up in Me Too. He'd get himself really riled up about counterculture, and usually when that happens, it's because the person has some skeletons in their closet, right? So I'm sure at that time he was probably hearing through the grapevine from his agents and whatever it may be about journalists calling up certain people to get stories about him. I'm sure that might happen. This is my own interpretation of it. And instead of him kind of being understanding and almost almost sort of, I don't know, doting about it and kind of, you know, diminishing his kind of macho aspect of it, and kind of trying to kind of present himself as an understanding ally in this sort of, you know, in this sort of climate that we're in. He tried to fight back, and unfortunately he just isn't the guy you want to hear from when it comes to that kind of thing. If Chris Pratt, look what's happening in social media. If Chris Pratt can get cancelled, who's by all accounts is one of the most lovable people in Hollywood, everyone has a good thing to say about Chris Pratt, right? So much so that people were basically siding with him when he got divorced, right? Like, oh, how could anyone divorce Chris Pratt? He's fucking amazing. He's always getting glowing reviews. He's an actual Christian, like a Hollywood person that's actually, you know, legitimately no sex before marriage and all that sort of malarkey, is a hardcore Christian, and he gets cancelled for saying some innocuous joke on social media. So what would give Bryan Callen the thinking or the belief that somehow he could be the voice to push back against cancel culture? He just wasn't the guy. So I definitely don't think this version of the story is definitely true. He wanted to speak about it, and obviously when he put that statement out there, Cast Media, who are definitely the bosses of The Fighter and the Kid, who are definitely have more say on what they do on the show than Brian or Brendan like to lead on, which is their business. But I'm sure they're the ones that put the kibosh on it and said, no, you can't go on our platform, you can't go on our show, you can't discredit you can't put smart on our sponsors, you can't do any of that stuff whilst these allegations are out there in the open. You have to address it on your own, but not on our show. I definitely think that's what happened, but let's continue.
What do you mean you can't be these? Like, I can't be associated with it. They make no matter what.
Went back.
Again, so if it's John Jones every other weekend, cool. If it's Billy, who we've never heard, you know, from what I know, Bryan Callen, he's a great dude.
He's been so supportive of me.
Yeah, he's always. So my initial reaction was, I can't be associated with it anymore. Not right now. I can't until we figure more things out, until the process goes along further. There's nothing I can do.
Which again, I don't believe. I think he was definitely told that he can't get him on the show, which is why they basically tried to do the fight in the rinks, which is, you know, it's laughable now that they tried to kind of just change the name a little bit and record it in the same studio and thought they could just get away by putting it behind a paywall. That didn't work. Put a kibosh on that. Then they obviously, you know, they just continued. They rebranded the show into what he's doing now with Sam Tripoli, which people are obviously enjoying to some level of enjoyment. But I don't necessarily think it was a decision of Brian saying, no, you go ahead and you do the show. I'll stay here and hold it down for these allegations. I don't think that happened. They tried to fight against it, but the industry said no, because unfortunately in the climate we live in at the moment, allegations is as bad as a charge. And I just think the only frustrating part of it, as being a fan of these guys, especially with Brian, who I legitimately think is funny, is that he's so emotional about other people that go through these you know, instances of cancel culture and Me Too. He should have been a little bit more understanding of the climate and known how to react to it. He just didn't react to it in the right way, and he essentially kind of fucked himself over really by his reaction and how he went about addressing them, and put himself in this unfortunate sticky position, which, if you think about it, is maybe some people would argue is karma for how they threw Chris D'Elia under the bus, right? Getting on camera and crying and Brendan saying, I can't talk, and all that nonsense, and pretending like they didn't know the guy, essentially put them at a loss and put them on the back foot. Because when this allegation came out, no one was going to come out and back them. No one was going to go out of their way to say anything good about them, because, you know, they set the narrative by distancing themselves to Chris D'Elia, in my opinion.
So I guess for me, you know, if I'm being dead honest, it's more of like, in LA, I feel so lonely because my guys left, man. My guys left. So Rogan's gone, right? Who's, you know, he's a mentor and one of my best friends, and he leaves. And I still talk to him every day, but it's just different when he's not here. So he leaves. Theo moves to Nashville, even though I still see him every other week because we do King of the Sting, but he's in Nashville.
So he's doing that remotely?
No, he flies in. We shoot like 2 episodes, and he flies back out.
Wow, dude, that's crazy.
Yeah, he's the man. So
and that actually might be that might actually be a long-term positive for Brendan. I think a lot of people, especially other fellow comedians and some comedy fans, look at him and think, oh, he's only there because of these connections to Joe Rogan. If he didn't have Joe as a friend, he wouldn't be as successful as he is now at the moment, which there's probably some truth to it. But, you know, entertainment industry, from from the beginning of time has relied quite greatly on your network. So it's not his fault that he kind of exploited it and used it to his advantage. But I do think there was an aspect of him that maybe got a little bit comfortable. Some of the stories that you heard him talk about, like, people's comedy and whether it was good or not, his parking spaces and all this sort of stuff, you kind of felt like he was starting to feel himself a lot more than he probably should have. And I remember Joey Diaz saying a couple of times in his podcast that sometimes being friends with high level people can sometimes be detrimental to your career, because you can sometimes, because you're around these people so often, you make them laugh and all this sort of malarkey, it can give you the false impression that you're on their level when you actually aren't. So it can kind of fuck up your development as a comedian. And I can imagine that's the same thing in all creative industries. So if anything, having all these friends move and having to kind of start from zero, which isn't really start from zero because he's still part of the Comedy Store, he still has all these other connections, but not having that support bubble of some of the best comedians in the world being his closest friends and being around him all the time might allow him to be a little bit more, I wouldn't say humble because he does come across as being humble, but it might allow him to understand his level a bit more and actually work at his craft. Because at the moment, looking at his special and just generally how he kind of tells jokes on podcasts, he's not the most funniest guy in the world, isn't it? Or in terms of stand-up, maybe conversational wise he's really good in that regard, that's why he's successful in podcasting, but he's gonna have to work a lot at kind of like honing his comedic voice, and maybe it would go a long way doing it alone, quote unquote, without those kind of industry heavyweights that he's kind of associated with, than it would be doing it with them. I don't know, that's my opinion. Let's continue.
He flies there, but you gotta realize Theo, man, he'd be at my house every other day playing with my kids and stuff like that. So Theo's in Nashville, and then Bryan, I can't be on the air with Bryan, and then it's just like the Rat Pack broke up, so yeah, it's lonely, man.
So what are you gonna do?
It's heartbreaking. Trying to
and that's the one, isn't it? That's one people don't see. It's sympathy that people don't really have, and that must be a lot to deal with. Being surrounded by that, because again, the negative side of it, you hear from the New York comedians, they're a little clique. They don't let anybody in. It's sort of like a bros club. If you're on Joe Rogan's friend, you get all these benefits, blah, 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 blah. But when you're actually in that circle, to have the main person leave, and then for you not to have those people around you, must get a little bit lonely, especially when you're like, it looks like he's having to hang around with people that he probably wouldn't necessarily waste his time hanging around with unless he's on the road, right? Some of his openers and stuff, I don't know, maybe it's not true. Behind the scenes, he probably does it, but having to foster a whole different community now must be really hard to do, especially during COVID, especially in LA, where they've probably been the most afraid of reopening the industry as opposed to other states. So it's going to take a while for him even to kind of get back on that comedic train in general when living in LA, blah, 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 blah. So I can definitely understand that.
Again, I don't think there's any book I can buy that shows when your friend gets accused of rape, this is how you deal with it.
During a pandemic.
Yeah, so it's like Fighter and the Kid has given me so much. It's like, that's my baby. What people don't realize is, for a long time, Fire and Kid wasn't important to Bryan. Bryan was a big actor, and Bryan had stand-up, and all I had fighting and podcasting. And I loved the podcast, and I put everything into it. So there were days where me and Bryan would get in fights because I'd beg him to come and do the show because it was never his thing. His friends made fun of him for doing podcasts, his Hollywood friends.
Wow.
And now, who's laughing? All these dumbasses have one.
And that's the funny thing about it, right? The irony of this story is not lost on me. Like, because again, that's why I'm saying that I think this might be the last video I'm doing this, because I'm getting a little bit tired of talking about this, and I think sometimes I'm getting a bit tired of it, and I think people need to kind of go through the process of recovering from this without having people like me comment on their issues, right? It just comes across a bit nasty. I don't know. There's probably more to it, but I don't know. I'm just getting a bit tired about talking about this, but the irony isn't lost on me, and the fact that Bryan's had a year where he's finally become a success in Hollywood. He's got a show made of him based on his character he has on the Goldbergs. He gets pretty good reviews on it. He's featured in a Joker, if not for a millisecond. He's still, kind of doors are opening for him, all basically based on the success of the podcast for the most part. He's moving in different Hollywood circles. He's got that famous picture of him at Sly and Stallone's house, and then he's feeling himself so much in that period. He finally decides to separate from the mother of his children, who he says they had problems behind the scenes. Again, not my business, but that happens. At that age, which is questionable to say the least, but let's just agree with it. He breaks up his family. He goes on his own. People say he's changed for the better for it. He's a whole different person now. Remember Joe Rogan, Bryan Callen, all these said this sort of thing. Then he goes and gets his Liz done because he feels like he's become self-conscious and he wants to kind of revitalize his look. That's going to maybe allow him to book more roles, essentially, right? And then he gets hit with all these allegations at the same time. So the one time where you need your closest friends in Hollywood to be around you, they aren't, because you have this cloud over your head. The one time you need your family, they're not around you because you divorced your actual mother of your children. Right? Like the one time you need some money, you've wasted it on your lids. And the only thing that's actually keeping you afloat is the money that's coming from a podcast you didn't care about in the beginning. Because you were trying to make it as a Hollywood actor and you thought that was a waste of time. And you got that friction. You understood that friction. Some of the arguments used to have on there make a lot of sense now, because Brendan was trying to tell him in certain terms, which I still think Bryan he's still kind of resistant against, which I don't really make no sense. Bryan was never going to become the next Tom Hanks or whatever that kind of legend that was told to him. He was, his probably level was probably going to be Goldberg's, and that was only as a function of kind of the success of the podcast. So for him to try and fight as much as he is now to keep that Hollywood career is really bizarre, considering that most likely, from my opinion, talking about it from the outside in, that is completely over. He should really concentrate on podcasting and his stand-up, which he's expert at. He's really good on podcasting. He has a whole history of doing great shows on podcasts. 10-minute podcasts will go down in fucking as one of the best shows, in that comedic scene. He's obviously an excellent stand-up. That's what he should be focusing his energies at. Trying to make it in Hollywood, that door's completely shut. That industry is incestuous, right? They're all gonna follow each other. The fact that he's been accused of something and they're about Me Too supposedly, they're not gonna open that door from ever again. That door's completely shut. So this sort of like throwing Chris D'Elia under the bus and all that sort of stuff is really bizarre. But then on the other side of things, I understand it, because he's essentially spent his entire career trying to justify he's spent his entire career trying to make it in Hollywood, right? He comes from a fairly affluent family, if you believe what you read on the internet. So he's trying to prove himself to his family, prove himself to himself. He finally makes it in Hollywood after 20, 30 years of struggling. He has some of the best rejection stories ever. If you listen to some of the earlier T5K podcast shows, he finally gets there. And for it to be taken away in this sort of manner, it's definitely going to cause you a lot of internal problems, struggles of you having to kind of finally grasp, like, is this career over for me? So I understand he's kind of desire to fight for everything he can, tooth and nail to keep that career, because he's fought so hard to get in this position. But in this current climate, unfortunately, that ride is over, in my opinion, which then leads me to the point of like why I think I might start talking about it, is because I think that ride's over, and I think people should be given an opportunity to try and rebuild their lives. And I don't think me talking about this sort of thing is helping in that journey, in my opinion. But let me know in the comments.
So for me, like, that's always been my ride or die, is fighting the kids. So I'll be honest, there's probably about a month ago, I was just like, I should probably just shut this thing down. I have my 2 other shows, I'm fine. And then I gave a lot of thought about it and asked Chappelle Lacey and Malik B to do the podcast with me.
Those guys are great.
Yeah, they're so much fun.
Yeah, Josh Wolf's good too.
Josh Wolf, but I really think there's something special with Chappelle and Malik, and I have fun again. But we're probably gonna have to rebrand it and stuff like that. But it's it's straight up heartbreaking, man. Yeah. It's heartbreaking.
Are you gonna move, or are you gonna stay in LA?
I'm going to wait till after the election, and then I'm going to give it some time after that, see if LA bounces back. And if it's still North Korea here, I'll probably move.
Wow.
And you can't blame the guy. Again, I think, say what you want about the dude, he is hardworking, he is determined. He's essentially, built himself up from zero, considering, how he was prior when he was in fighting and sort of struggling to earn a living there. For him to build the podcast into what it's been now, obviously with some assistance, with some help, as it's been shown over the years, some really influential cosigns, still his consistency over the years is really something to be admired. And, having to rebrand a show in the midst of a flipping pandemic when your best friend's being cancelled is definitely difficult. And he's maybe stumbled upon some pretty good co-hosts, which, the dynamic still needs to be ironed out. I think he's still sort of struggling to he's not really, I don't know why. It seems like Brendan's really bad around black people. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just my observation, but I don't know. He looks like he doesn't really get that kind of humor. He sort of struggles with it, even though he likes to use hip-hop colloquialisms, and obviously he dresses in a certain way. He really struggles with that personality. I'm not sure because he finds it overpowering, or he doesn't know how to he doesn't know, inherently he's really bad at sort of what do they call it? Bantering, right? He's kind of bad at bantering. He's kind of bad at taking jokes in jest. He kind of clams up when he feels like he can't say an insult back. You see a lot happening in the King and the Sting when Fio's roasting him. You can see it kind of gets to a point where it starts to really hurt his feelings. So he'd be the worst roast special person, right? Might be the best in terms of TV entertainment, but in terms of his personal experience, he'd completely hate it. And he's always kind of struggled with that kind of poking that comedians do. He's kind of sensitive in that way. So that needs to be ironed out in that respect. But he's definitely stumbled upon something pretty good in terms of Chappelle and the Malik, in terms of being two co-hosts. But it definitely is difficult to go through that thing, I think, doing this on your own, especially during these times, I'd imagine.
You said something about Bryan Callen not being like super into the fighter and the kid, but I remember Bryan had his own podcast before Fighter and the Kid.
Had 14 listeners.
And I went over to his house and did his podcast like in his kitchen or something, I think. And I
love
was like, wow,
man.
yeah,
I love
this
it.
isn't that big of an operation. And then
What year was that?
I don't know.
2013, 2012,
something like that. Yeah, 2013 sounds about right. And so then the Fighter and the Kid, and it was crazy because it's like, wow, like the feedback that I got after doing the Fighter and the Kid, I heard about it from everyone. I think I said on the podcast, like, hey, if you're listening, tweet me. And it was just like flooded with tweets. I was like,
we have this ride or die fan base, man. And I think, again, I think what's tough is not be able to get on the mic and like, hey, this is what's going on. This is why Brian's not on the show. But I just contractually and legally, I can't do that. And it fucking kills me, man. Because they're probably like, where's Brian? I'm like, dude, trust me. I wish he was here.
No, but we know why he's not on there, innit? It's not like a big secret. It's pretty well documented why he's not on the show. Again, some of these sort of narratives they spin, I get it, it's for the fans, but we know why he's not on the show. He's been accused of rape, innit? Like, standard procedure in this era that we live in at the moment, in this current climate. You can't just be going on the show and pretending like this thing isn't happening. You have to address it some way, shape, or form, go to court, whatever may be done. Jeremy Piven is a far better... No, let's say Jeremy Piven is probably a higher profile than maybe a Bryan Callen, and his career has never bounced back from that one allegation that he had, right? And he's been known to be pretty much a bit of a prick in Hollywood, right? Even before all the allegations. So to get one allegation against Jeremy Piven and for him to kind of turn into a stand-up, why do people think that Brian's gonna suddenly be able to come back and just be talking about it openly? It just doesn't happen that way. It's just, unfortunately, maybe Neil deGrasse Tyson might be the only recent example I've heard of somebody go through something, accuse something, and then be internally investigated via the network. I think NBC or CBS, I think, did it, and he got found to be not the allegations or claims against him got to be found not to be true, which I agree with, because I don't think in this era they were gonna networks go out their way to make sure they can prove. Maybe it's not true. Maybe if you're Neil deGrasse Tyson and you generate a certain amount of income for a network, they're going to go out their way to make sure that you're not guilty. I don't know. But anyway, my point remains. Better people have been cancelled for lesser crimes than Bryan Callen has. So for people to assume that he's going to be able to kind of jump back on and say what he wants to say on the podcast is really naive.
But it's just it's out of my control.
Are you talking to him pretty regularly?
Every day.
Nice.
And
but you were supposed to.
I still, I don't think Brian cares if I divulge this information. I still give Brian half the pay, even to this day. Even if he never does the show again, he'll still get money.
And that's why I think you have to rate Brendan, I think, and I'll leave it there. That's where I think people need to kind of give him a little bit more respect in that regard. To his friends, everyone has good things to say about the guy. He obviously goes out of his way to help his friends and be supportive. And the fact that he's doing that for Brian and giving him half of the money from TFAT-K, even when he's going through such a heinous thing, and he probably, you could be argued that Brendan has more of a right to the money now that he's doing completely on his own. And the fact that Brian got himself in this nonsense, or got himself involved in this nonsense, which is kind of hard, it's a bit hard just to say that because he didn't do this himself. He's been accused of this allegation. He's been accused of what he's been accused of. But you could understand if he said, no, I'm going to keep the money for myself because you're not doing the show anymore. But for him to acknowledge the influence that Brian's had on his career and to say, hey, as a way for me to say thank you, even if you are guilty of what you're guilty of, I'm going to always support you financially in any way that I can because I owe my career to you, that deserves a bit of credit. He deserves to be lauded and commended for that alone, because I think if you believe the narrative of Brendan through what his haters think of him, you would be led to believe that he's kept the money and kind of told Brian to kind of kick rocks. But the fact that he set up a Patreon for him which he didn't do in the beginning, which was mostly for the 500 rings, but allowed him to just do the Patreon on his own, make some money that way, and keep himself relevant and be able to kind of flex that kind of podcasting muscle, and also be able to kind of give him the money from the podcast just to keep him afloat. Even though Bryan probably doesn't need it because again he comes from a wealthy family, that definitely says a lot about Brendan. That kind of small gesture, and again, hard times they're gonna go through. I've always maintained I think Bryan went about dealing with this in a really wrong way. I don't think his career is going to come back in any meaningful way in Hollywood. I still think he's going to be still a solid stand-up and still be able to have a successful podcasting career. But his kind of persistence in making sure he stays his Hollywood career is really, really odd. But again, I understand he's worked most of his adult life to get where he's want to get to. It's within his interest to try and save it as best as he can if he thinks he's innocent of the things that he's been alleged of. But I still think in this current climate and what people are going through, especially during a pandemic, you definitely don't need my opinion on what's going on and trying to add more fuel to the fire just for clicks. It's not worth it. So this is the last I'm going to speak about this issue until something monumental comes out of it, something really groundbreaking in terms of the charges. Either way, I'm not going to speak about this again regarding this. But again, credit to Brendan for deciding to do what he did there, supporting his friend. And I think that goes a long way in kind of rewriting the narrative about that guy.